It is 6 o'clock, and I'll declare the February meeting of the Planning Committee open. Begin by an acknowledgement of country. Gala Kadich Wajuk Mort, Kayan Kadak Nija Walula Buja, where Jinang Wajuk Kajijin, where Nitying Bula Yeye. We acknowledge the Wajak people as the traditional owners of the greater Fremantle Walup area and recognise that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still important today. The committee tonight is from the left, Councillor Sullivan, Councillor Lorver, Councillor Archibald, who's deputising for Councillor Groom, who's involved in the Kimberley flood relief, Councillor Lang, and Councillor Kamada, who's deputising for Councillor Graham, who's unwell. The Mayor has another engagement, and I am Councillor Jones, the Chair of the committee. The remainder of people are officers here to assist the committee members in their deliberations. We've dealt with apologies and leaves of absence. Any disclosures of interest by members? None. Any responses to questions on notice? There are none. Public question time is for questions about items that are not on the agenda. None of those. Petitions? No petitions. Deputations? Presentations? Confirmation of minutes. So I move the minutes of the Planning Committee held on the 7th of December 2023. Is there a seconder? Councillor Lorver. All those in favour? Sorry? Which day says here dated 7th of December. An error in the agenda. So the agenda says 7th December 2023. It's obviously 22. Thank you for noticing that. So all those in favour? Thank you. Unanimous. Any elected member communication? Okay, so we'll move on to the reports. The first item is number 93 Stirling Highway, two-storey additions and change of use. The officer's recommendation is for refusal, and to speak against that, we have the architect, Hussein Uni. I hope I've got that correct. People speaking have 3 minutes. If you get the microphone as close to your mouth as possible, you have 3 minutes. You'll hear a small alarm when you've got 30 seconds to go. If you could wind up at that point, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So basically, so the application were advertised for public. So when there were an objection from the neighbor, which is the only neighbor anyway, he was a bit concerned about privacy issues and overshadowing. The good thing is, like, we had a meeting in the last couple of days with him. We explained everything, and we explained all the points. Which are the boundary wall and the overshadowing, the privacy, so it's basically we explained to him that there won't be any negative impact on his property, and we explained to him that compared to the existing overshadowing is only 3 square meters, which is very minor and won't affect anything. Regarding the proposal itself, I can say it will contribute positively to the streetscape because it will replace an ugly skeleton roof, and on the top of this, like, it will improve the quality of life of the user, especially if you look at the existing plan. Like, basically, there is no kitchen and there is no living area. So so the proposal, like, will have all the positive outcome in all the sides.
I just got a question, and I invite other questions. Now, I just want to confirm that you have now discussed the plans with the neighbour, and the neighbours signed the plans to say they have no objection.
Yes.
Is that the same neighbour that was objecting before?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the only neighbour anyway.
And the director has checked that, so just for benefit. Any questions? Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
So we'll go into committee. I'll see if anyone wants to move the office recommendation. There is an alternative recommendation for approval. So if there is no one wishing to move the recommendation for refusal, we can go straight to that. So I'll just give people a chance to move that. Okay, would someone like to move the alternative recommendation? Councillor Sullivan as a seconder. Councillor Lang, would you like to speak to that? I'll just better say, for the benefit, the main objection was from the neighbour. That's the reason it pretty much came to committee. The neighbour's now withdrawn that objection, so should be fairly straightforward. But Councillor Sullivan.
Thank you. I won't speak long. Effectively, I think the applicant's representative said it all. It is a difficult site. Those sites are very unusual, on Stirling Highway. The type of living accommodation is not going to be the same as the sort of thing that you might see in a, side street, a residential street of North Fremantle. And it's not without precedence either. And I think if perhaps if this gets up, which I'm sure it will, that we could add to the reasons for this that the proposal is consistent with other with similar forms of development in the immediate vicinity, which is demonstrated in the officer's report. So I think that would be a valid reason as well. Obviously, we're varying a little bit, but it is an unusual site, as has been said, and it is a quality development. It adds only 3 square metres of overshadowing, so I think they've done exceptionally well, given that it's basically a duplex with a dividing wall that runs east-west. So, yeah, all up, recommend for approval.
Are there any further speakers? I'll just make a comment that if you've noted on the plans, the Stirling Highway Road Reserve takes away most of the heritage cottage, if that, God forbid, was ever put in place. So the addition they're building now would be the house after the road reserve has been exercised. So yes, so I'm very happy to approve that. So I'll move the recommendation for approval. All those in favour? That's unanimous. And given, I did say we'd refer it to council, but given that the neighbours have withdrawn their objection, I don't think we need to do that anymore. So I'm happy to let that go through under delegated authority. So that decision is made tonight, and you can talk to the officers tomorrow. Thank you. The next item is number 120 Holland Street. It's an application for demolition, and the recommendation is for refusal. John Kirkness wishes to speak. Is he outside there somewhere? John, are you there? Sorry. John Kirkness wishes to speak in favour of the officer's recommendation.
Yes, thanks, councillors. And I was very pleased to see the officer's report come out about this place. I live adjacent to this property. It's a wonderful precinct of workers' cottages. It's substantially intact, primarily because the City of Fremantle used to have a density bonus policy that saw the majority of these workers' cottages retained and restored. This house is one of the few that wasn't done, but it is substantially intact, and it is in fact in no different condition than a great many of those workers' cottages before they were restored. By way of example, my cottage, which is 1903, so it's a year younger than this one, similarly had asbestos cladding, non-original windows, some adaptation, disintegrating veranda, collapsed ceilings. It had all those things, but it was quite capable of conservation and renovation, which of course it was. And these cottages all form part of a very significant precinct, which fortunately did get listed as a heritage area belatedly in 2018, I think. So I very strongly support the council officer's recommendation for this building to be retained. It is particularly significant in this streetscape because it's a wonderful, that part of Holland Street is a wonderful streetscape. And I really don't see that it needs to be demolished simply because somebody might think they want to have a new house in this precinct. The house has sat vacant, it's sat empty for probably the better part of a decade. So the previous owners who've owned it for years had no lack of opportunity to apply for demolition permits before they sold it. And equally, it could have easily, that demolition permit could have been, approval could have been sought prior to its sale. So I don't see why that at this point should be a reason to otherwise see this house lost where all the others have been kept. So yes, I strongly support the recommendation, and will just express a bit of concern that the very slick professional heritage report that was submitted by the applicant in the application could possibly have come up with an argument that it had no heritage significance. It simply doesn't stack up. So again, I support the officer's recommendation.
Any questions? No, thank you. So, Michael Hopper, you're the applicant. 3 minutes, thank you.
Good evening. We've lived at 116 Holland Street, 2 doors up from the property in question, for 25 years. Our intention in purchasing the property at 120 Holland Street is to remain living in the street we love for the foreseeable future. We have no intention of subdividing, reselling, or otherwise profiting from the development. We're entirely committed to building a beautiful, environmentally sustainable home for our family to enjoy for decades to come that complements the streetscape we love. Per the requirement of city planning, we've employed a structural engineer and a heritage architecture firm to assess the property at 120 Holland Street. We did not seek to find professionals who were supportive of demolition. We informed them both we were conflicted about the property. We're strongly supportive of the city's stance on heritage, but we're unsure whether the building could be salvaged. The structural engineer's report forms part of the additional information document for tonight's meeting, and I ask that any committee members who have not read it, please do so. For some reason, the heritage assessment you have performed is not included in the additional information, but I ask that it be read and considered also. Both contain information worthy of consideration that's not necessarily present in the city's assessment. Our decision to seek demolition was significantly influenced by both reports. They conclude that the building has been significantly altered from its original state and that high-level remedial works required would substantially alter the existing structure to an extent that the structural aspects of the building would be new, is a quote from the structural engineer's report. We believe there are many apparent discrepancies between the city's report and these reports that need investigating so an informed decision on the merit of the demolition can be reached. The city's assessment states that, for example, many of the architraves, cornices and skirtings are original and could be salvaged. We believe on inspection that this may not be the case. The engineer's assessment stating restumping and replacement of a significant percentage of the existing floor, joists, bearers and trimmers gives a more accurate scope of the subfloor restoration work required than the city's assessment, and I believe it is this work in particular that led the structural engineer to conclude that the current structure may not be economically salvageable. The city's assessment agrees that the internal and external cladding would need to be replaced and suggests that a replica front veranda could be built based on a picture from circa 1920, showing the house in the mid-distance and by copying design elements from the contemporaneous nearby buildings. A house that is essentially new structurally, in cladding, in detailing, and with a replica veranda is exactly what our structural engineer told me in conversation was the best we could hope for. A replica cottage is not authentic and not what we want to achieve. Whilst the local planning policy 3.6 states condition of the place is not necessarily an acceptable reason for demolition, the condition of the property inescapably has a bearing on the cost of restoring the property to a habitable state. We're not motivated by profit, but we do need to be able to afford the works required. If it is the intention of the committee to reject our application to demolish the cottage, I ask that the matter be deferred until we are able to work with the town planners to resolve the apparent conflicts in the current reports and achieve a mutually acceptable outcome. I apologise in the delay for seeking contact with the planners prior to tonight's meeting, which has been due to some challenging personal circumstances. Thank you.
Are there any questions? Okay, thank you. I will move the officer's recommendation, which is for demolition. Is there a seconder? Councillor Lorber.
Oh, just a quick question. The applicant has mentioned that he might be willing to accept a deferral to allow some more time. Should we move that before we get into the?
I think I need to move the recommendation first, and then you can ask for a deferral. But I think we should have some discussion before considering deferrals, just to see if there's general support for that. Once the deferral's moved, there's not supposed to be any discussion, though. We sometimes do all of that. So I've moved it. Is there a seconder? Councillor Sullivan, would you like to speak?
Thank you. For those who've never heard me talk about timber houses, it's been one of my areas of special interest for a very long time, having written a couple of timber house manuals for different organisations, and the owner of a state heritage listed timber village with no less than 40 timber cottages. And the reality is these cottages are almost always in a very similar state after such a long period of time. That doesn't diminish the fact that they also ought to be kept. Now, I totally understand what the applicant is saying in terms of that significant portions of the building would need to be replaced, both the cladding elements, all the bits on the framing, and potentially significant parts of the framing, as if that diminishes so significantly the heritage that it would have no heritage left. But the reality in timber housing is that timber is not a forever material. It's not the same as building something out of, say, granite. So it is almost normal practice to anticipate to have to replace both claddings and structures in timber cottages on a regular basis. The disappointing thing, obviously, is when they're left um, through the previous ownership for such a long period of time where the damage accumulates, places become vacant, they get vandalised, they don't get looked after, the termite treatments are not kept up to speed, etc., etc. But it doesn't, in my mind, diminish them to the point where they have no heritage. And at the very least, um, the front couple of rooms of this cottage and its presentation to the street have significant streetscape value, and they have significant community value. I mean, there are many people in that area, as has been stated just tonight. One person stated tonight, who have bought into those areas knowing that they are a heritage precinct, knowing that if they've spent good money fixing up old cottages, challenging projects, a lot of good money, making them suitable for another 50 to 100 years, that there's an expectation that council will ensure that other buildings in that precinct are similarly protected and hopefully upgraded. Perhaps the demolition question is not for me the worrying issue. The issue is whether or not the applicant and the building department and our heritage department can actually come together and talk about the extent of urgent works that are going to be needed to that, and basically improve the understanding about what can happen to a building like that. How much do you need to retain in situ while you're doing the works? I just showed Councillor Archibald a picture of a veranda that was literally being rebuilt 2 days ago, where the only bit that really could be salvaged that didn't need replacing was the roof, the veranda beam, and everything above it. Quite easy to do, a couple of days' work. And that's often the case too in a lot of these, in the substantial part of a lot of these buildings. So I would caution, as I have previously said on other sites, caution us not to sort of automatically run down, oh, it's in a very bad condition, ipso facto must be a demolition project. That's not always the case. In fact, it's rarely the case with a timber building because they are so easy structurally to do replacement works when required because they're lightweight and you can prop things and you can take whole areas out and prop things quite easily and put in replacement elements very easily without losing the integrity of the building. You're replacing like for like each step of the way, and you end up with a renewed version of the building as it was built and intended to be, all those moons ago. Thank you.
Is there any further comment? The question I'd perhaps like discuss, it doesn't seem to me deferring this doesn't necessarily help. I mean, the officers are happy to talk to the applicant any time about how they can restore the house. And in the case of a house like this, there's sometimes not a lot of difference between demolition and restoration. By the time you've taken things apart and put them back together, as long as you put them back together the same way they were, it's not considered demolition. Okay, so I'm interested if members of the committee think deferring it would be helpful, because we would doubtfully still not support demolition after it came back from the deferral, is my point. So, but we would probably support a reconstruction of something of similar shape and size on the front. So, yes, Councillor Archibald.
It's red. Am I on? Yeah. Okay. Look, I would support a deferral on the grounds that it would give the applicant the opportunity to consider how they might be able to reconstruct the house. I think for me, it's not so much keeping the entire house, but the really significant part is the piece that addresses the front, like the front hip part of the cottage. And I do think that there is a lot of reasonable quality timber in the cottage still that could be used, salvaged. And it's almost like the cottage needs to be deconstructed to be reconstructed. And I have seen that happen in White Gum Valley, where a very early, would have been 1900, 1910 cottage was deconstructed and reconstructed and therefore restored. And whatever fabric of that house was reasonably salvageable, it was, and then incorporated back into the house. But the key thing was that it maintained the integrity of the streetscape and how that house addressed its environment. So I'd be happy to support a deferral if that was a good way of discussing it with the applicant about, what components should be kept and how it might be able to be integrated into a dwelling that could also give the applicants what they are seeking.
In that case, we'd need some form of words along the lines that is deferred to allow the applicant to meet with council officers to discuss ways of retaining the house or something to that effect. Could you work on something to that effect? And are there any further speakers? We haven't moved deferral, but we're happy to discuss it if anybody else wishes to speak. Councillor Archibald again.
I was just going to say, perhaps if it was something like retain those portions of the house that maintain the integrity of the streetscape, or something like that.
Any further discussion on deferral or not, or anything else? Councillor Lang.
Thanks. Yeah, for mine, absolutely couldn't support demolition of this, given the streetscape. It's such a beautiful streetscape. I could never live it myself if we lost this house on this streetscape. In terms of the deferral, I'm just a bit confused about it. We're voting on a demolition or not a demolition. I can't see how a deferral to negotiate what we do and don't demolish. I don't understand how that works, but what's in front of us is a application for demolition, and I don't support it. I'll be curious to see what a deferral looks like, but it seems like a bit of a grey area to me.
Well, that's the same question I have. I'm not sure a deferral is helpful to the applicant because it still has to submit new plans, and if it's refused tonight, you have the opportunity to appeal. If it's not refused tonight, you've got to go through the deferral process. So I'd be interested to see any other. I mean, having a deferred demolition doesn't really help the applicant at all if our intention is to vote in favour of demolition eventually, if you understand what I mean. So nobody's actually moved a deferral. Does anybody want to try it? Yes, Councillor Lorver.
Yeah, so I agree with my council colleagues. I would be voting in favor of the officer's recommendation if we didn't put a deferral in place. But the question that I had about this is, could there be a partial demolition? In some areas, is that a possibility that could come back? Like, as Councilor Archibald pointed out, I share her concerns about the main pieces are the ones that present themselves to the street. Is that a possibility? I mean, could this come back in a form that is just a partial demolition, I guess?
Well, I don't know if you recall the building on Stirling Highway at the bottom of White Street, is it? I mean, that was basically totally deconstructed and reconstructed, and that was not counted as a demolition. So there is plenty of scope for that. I think, as we've said, the key thing is the streetscape and the basic shape and size of the original house. It would be quite normal, I would think, to knock off the skillion as part of a renovation or restoration. It's the main roof generally is the case, the veranda and the streetscape. So, I mean, although deferral hasn't been moved, I would say that I wouldn't support it, but someone is free to move it if they wish to.
Could I just ask a question, please? I just wanted to ask if I could ask the Director of Planning the question that this is an application for demolition, as the others have stated. What we really need is an application for a planning proposal. So could he just give some advice on that, please?
Thank you. And through the chair, I think it's a very good point. The application is purely for demolition, and that is why we're recommending against that. Under your scheme, we don't have any other option once the significance of the place has been given some significance. I would recommend that there is a refusal here. Of course, we would work with the applicant, and I think there would be a considerable part of the cottage, presumably around the back of the cottage, that could quite easily be demolished. But it's most of its contribution is part of that streetscape contribution as well. So it's really the front couple of rooms, the veranda, we would be seeing as where the focus should be, and we would gladly work with the applicant to make sure whatever goes onto the back also fits. But in terms of an outright demolition, that's why our recommendation was refusal.
Any further speakers? So I'll close the debate. I'll just say, as was mentioned earlier, this particular piece of street was the real hotspot of Clause 39 density bonus, to the extent that one builder was would buy a house, live in the front house, build a new house at the back, and then restore the front house, and then move down the street and buy the next one. And that's probably why you'd recall that, why there's this consistency about this particular bit of street. There's a lot of it was done by the same builder, and taking full advantage of the Clause 39. Just a question to the planners: is a second house possible on this now without that clause? Because we don't have that clause anymore. Is it the change in the R codes allows a second house? You may not be able to answer that now, but
we would take that on notice.
yeah, because originally the lots were not big enough for a second house unless you applied the density bonus, and the density bonus required you to keep the front house and restore it. So that's why we have this particular bit of streetscape, and I think that, again, in recognition of the people who've done that and bought there, I think that we have an obligation to retain that sort of integrity in the street. So I'll move to a vote. All those in favour of refusing the demolition? That's unanimous. Yes. Yeah. And so that's unanimous. I think you've heard clearly that there's plenty of scope to do something, and I hope you can discuss that with the officers. Timothy Jones, is that one of you? So this is Bromley Road, item 5. Just bear with me a minute. Bromley Road, single-storey grouped dwelling, recommended for approval. You're the applicant or the designer? The applicant. So 3 minutes, please.
There we go. Thank you. Esteemed members of council, thank you for your time. In speaking in favour of the planning officer's recommendation, the reason the application has come before the council now is simply because of local planning policy 2.4 regarding boundary walls, and the comments from the neighbour regarding overshadowing. Essentially, and as has been addressed in the report, the amount of overshadowing being a eastern side of the neighbouring property is minimal at best as defined in the R codes. And if it were not for local planning policy 2.4, this application would have been able to have been assessed under delegated authority by the planning officers. So we are simply encouraging that the norm that is held in most areas of the metropolitan area, as supported by the R codes, continue to be applied. Are there any questions?
Questions of the applicant? No, thank you. I'll move the officer's recommendation, which is for approval. Is there a seconder? Councillor Lawver, any discussion? Councillor Lawver.
Yeah, I just wanted to I know the discretion for the setback is fine, and the discretion on the height in the standard fences are 1.8 meters, and then you're always allowed to put a little bit on top that's permeable. Can you just remind me what that additional height is that could be put on top of this fence that's permeable?
Are we talking about the front fence or the boundary fence? Or
The boundary fence.
dividing fence.
Yeah. Yes, the dividing fence between the front and the back lot.
I think this is covered by state law, isn't it? There's a minimum. You might be able to clarify that.
Just from my understanding, I believe it's up to 2.1, but can I take that on notice and just get that confirmed for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to confirm that you actually could build that fence higher, and so the discretion actually could be less if that fence was higher. So I support the officer's recommendation on this.
There's also as well under the building regulations, if a fence is over 1.8 meters, building permit is also required as well. So not only planning.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Okay, happy to move to a vote. So all those in favour of approval. That's a decision by delegation tonight. You can talk to the officers tomorrow. Back to item 3. Watkins Street, one of those triangular lots on the corner with three grouped dwellings recommended for approval. I'll move the officer's recommendation. Is there a seconder? Councillor Lawver. Any discussion? Councillor Lawver.
I'll keep this brief. I've seen a lot of these corner lots with 3 houses done extremely poorly. You don't have to go much around Hilton to see some really, really bad construction that's been done, in my opinion. And I was initially hesitant, but this one looks like it's done really well. I'm totally in favor of supporting this and seeing how it comes out. So,
any further discussion? Yeah, well, I think it's a project that could only have been done if all 3 houses were built at the same time. You probably couldn't have ever put one in and then done the others as infill. But the fact that it's all being done at once and sold and everybody knows what they're getting, or they've already bought it and know what they're getting, I'm not sure. But yeah, it looks like quite an imaginative and creative solution. Are we happy to vote? Any further? All those in favour? That's unanimous. Item 4 is Grigg Place, single-storey additions and alterations. Just bear with me. I'll find it. Recommended for approval, and there is a minor amendment being suggested. So I'll move the officer's recommendation. As a seconder, Councillor Kamada. And any discussion, or do you want to move your amendment, Councillor Sullivan?
Thank you. I'll move my amendment. Hopefully, get a seconder. Yeah, I just felt that it just the way the wording was, it just felt a little bit sort of heavy-handed, and you know, I have to say there are a lot of people out there that probably do some things with their studios that we don't always know about, and we don't know about them because no one cares. And until such point as it really impacts on somebody, nothing ever gets done about it, and that's the way the world typically works. So rules are in place to protect communities, but they don't always have to be applied. So if someone isn't applying for something, they're not applying to do anything wrong. So we don't need to kind of like make this sort of almost heavy-handed sort of message to them that you shouldn't be even thinking about doing something wrong. So therefore, it's suffice, and I'd almost not be bothered with the advice note, but it would be suffice just to have the advice note to if obviously because staff have some concern that it might be used inappropriately.
I was just curious to know if a studio is actually defined in our scheme or in our codes. Does it have any meaning? A shed with a window, or it's obviously not a studio apartment, which is understood. But anyway, so I think that's another good reason not to. I mean, it's like saying everybody who builds a shed, you're not allowed to live in the shed. and they might still live in the shed anyway. So the amendment is moved and seconded. All those in favour? That's unanimous. So back to the motion as amended. Any further discussion? Okay, those in favour? That's unanimous. That ends the committee items. The next two items are council items, so they will be going to council anyway. As I recall, this one only came here because of a procedural, isn't it? The Paris Street, the triangle on the corner of William Street and Paris Street. Is that the one? Only got back here because of a standing orders conflict. So I will move the officer's recommendation. Is there a seconder? Councillor Archibald. Any discussion? Yep, Councillor Archibald.
Thank you. Yes, look, I think part of it was also too that some people wanted a little more clarity about exactly what was being proposed, and so that was part of the reasoning. But I just would like to add that that the extension of the Fairbairn ramp is a really important um, thing to recreate visually, even though we can't recreate the entire ramp. And I was chatting earlier with the Director of Planning about the opportunity to try and do a little bit more now that we're going to have a visual representation of the ramp in that section of where it used to be. I mean, the prison is a part of a World Heritage listing. It really is hugely significant, and I think it's time that we started to kind of reinstate, even visually, some of these connections back to the city. So I did ask whether we could consider what it would cost to at least continue the same type of paving that we're going to use to reflect the ramp section, because that will be different to what's adjacent to the rest, in the rest of the paving area. So whether we could continue that across and connect up with the rest of the ramp as it goes up to the prison. So I'm hopeful that that the Director of Planning and the Director of Infrastructure could have a look at that, because if it's not too costly, that we could perhaps even try to make sure at least we've got the right bricks, and that we can do some more work to have greater clarity on that connection back with the steps. But I certainly do support this particular project, and I think it's fabulous that we now have the opportunity to really visually reinstate the old alignment of the ramp, even if it's only in that form. Thank you.
I'll just ask the director to comment, but looking at the plans, it looks like it does that. The paving changes at a certain point, and the width is the same. So I'll just ask the director to comment, and if we're not happy with that, we could just put an extra clause on before it goes to council to say, to ask them to verify that it reflects, as well as possible, reflects the qualities of the ramp, maybe.
Thank you. And through the chair, the width of the ramp is interpreted in the plans from UDLA, which is in the attachments. And I think the point Councillor Archibald is making is the potential perhaps to extend that width that is in the plans across Parish Street itself, and to express that in the footpath on the northern side of Parish Street near our car park. And I've had a quick chat with our acting CEO. I think if we can take that one offline and look at putting together what a price might be on that, and put that up for budget considerations for 23-24.
That wouldn't be part of this application anyway, because it's a roadworks.
It would be a separate little project.
So you're happy for that to go that way, or would you like to add a?
That would be excellent. I mean, it can be done offline, but and I do understand that getting it to be across the actual road in the road paving is probably not likely to happen in the near future. But the idea can still be there. But we could certainly deal with the pavement areas on either side, the pedestrian pavement areas, and there was some suggestion about better addressing the steps in a better way. But I will leave that with the directors.
So the Director of Infrastructure is going to make a comment.
Thank you. Through the chair. What we'll do is put together a bid, project inception document, and include it in your packs for discussion on Monday, because this is essentially a small project.
Any further discussion? Councillor Lorver.
Yeah, I'm going to vote against this tonight, but it'll probably still have enough votes to get through to council. I know, and I've kind of gone back and forth on whether I was going to do that or not. Um, and the reason is, I mean, I wasn't here in 2018, and there was a commitment made. So I'm not sure how I'll vote at council, but I may have thought about this differently. I mean, we deferred this to get more information about what this was going to look like, and we got a little one pager here that lists some benefits and has a little tiny drawing at the bottom, and that's about it. So I'm not really convinced that giving up, $90,000 a year in parking revenue for a park like this that is necessarily something that I would support. So I feel like I can vote against this tonight and really have a think about it between now and council. But um, I'm concerned about them taking over for alfresco. There's all sorts of things that could potentially happen here, and we're just going to have to get this rate revenue from somewhere else. So while I'm not a fan of car parks, I think that I personally still have some considerations, and I do respect the previous decisions of other councils. So I just wanted to explain. I'm voting against this tonight, but I'll think about it really hard and long between now and the council when it comes back.
Councillor Kamada.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, look, since the full council meeting where this item first came up, I've had plenty of time to think about it, and I do share sort of between both what Councillor Lorver and Councillor Archibald between their comments. I understand that the notion and support the improved connection. It's actually re-establishing the connection between the vista of between the city and the prison, and obviously the improved public realm amenity. But I know it's only a small car park, but the car still is important. A lot of people still come to Fremantle with cars, and while we're establishing better infrastructure so that people can commute by rail or bus or other environmentally friendly means of transport, it's still an important aspect of for our city that, and I know I'm going on a slight tangent, for our city to ensure that not only do we maximise potential revenue through parking, but also for businesses, to get people into town. And it's something that people often raise is the parking in Fremantle. So, and where I'm getting to is when we do lose an amount of bays, whatever the amount of bays are there, maybe 10 or 15, it'd be nice if we had a policy, and maybe it is in there somewhere, where we replace those. And I know that we do have a longer term strategy for parking. It's something that we'll be reviewing, but that's something that I'd like to see, that we don't lose what we have in the city now, because I do think it's an important part of as I've said earlier, it's very important for us to maintain that. Thank you.
Councillor Sullivan.
Thank you. I would almost agree with Councillor Lorver if there had not been for decades strategies in place to look at these sorts of sites where someone in their wisdom basically knocked the teeth out of the city and put a car park in every location they could possibly squeeze one in. And that's the reality of what happened over a very long period of time when the car was king. So every opportunity, if a building got knocked down, we put it in a car park. If we could close a street and create a mall, we still put it in a car park, like in the Henderson Street Mall, half of which is a car park. So we've got these long-term sort of urban design philosophies that wherever the teeth were knocked out of the city, we ought to be replacing them. So where there is a real urban design need and emphasis, as there is clearly in this case, and a heritage one to boot, and a wayfinding one included on that, then it's very important that we accept that the loss of income from parking is simply a part of the improvement of the functional urban environment of the city. And there can't be too many more important elements in the city than the wayfinding between the centre of the city and the prison. This is our World Heritage listed precinct. So if $90,000 a year is what we have to do to improve that environment, then I think that's important. I also get that every time we take even one bay out, it actually makes it a little bit harder for people to get to the places that they want to go. And not everybody has an alternative form of transport. But I would also emphasise that lots of little car parks are really confusing and really difficult for people to navigate around the city. And one of the things that I think a project like this does is it really starts to acknowledge and recognise that Parry Street can become a human street, a pedestrian street, not just the sort of bypass road that it was originally designed to be. And that's important because we want to do the oval redevelopment. We've already seen um, the Freo social development sort of starting to take back control of the street. And we have a major car park on the other side of the road. So improving the public realm between the city and a major car park is going to make that car park a lot safer and a lot more it will feel like it's actually right in the city. So I think that will improve accessibility and wayfinding and probably will improve the use of that car park the more that we make that area connected to the city. So there are swings and roundabouts. These are sort of on balance decisions. And I think we've got this right. I wanted to say one last thing too. We went through a long period of time where it was almost impossible to get a developer to contribute to the public realm. And we're now starting to see that sort of corporate citizenship where developers get that they don't just build a building and it just happens, that they also have to work hand in glove with the community and the council in improving these spaces, that we can't just do them ourselves in the time frame that perhaps suits. So, Silverleaf have just through the JDAP process committed to the Queen Street frontage on their side of the street, and this project is sort of similar. So committed to doing the design work, committed to doing the building work, the heavy lifting that council can't do. So this is going to improve our city at a pace which wouldn't otherwise occur. And I'm forever grateful for that. Thank you.
Anyone else wish to speak? Sorry, Councillor Lang.
Yeah, just 2 points I touched on last week as well. Literally outside this window used to be a car park. We could have kept that for $90,000 a year, but what is a loss of amenity? And having a space like we do now attracts more investment to the city. So the total cost of having a public realm like that, we're going to generate more revenue over a longer period of time. We're going to attract more people to the city to go to the shops and to support the businesses. So car parking gets pushed to the periphery, but we're creating a city that people want to come to and stay in. So we'll make more money in the long run for that. And further to that point, the amount of rates that will be generated from this precinct that's being created, which is ginormous, is far going to outweigh the $90,000 we might lose in the short term. This wayfinding, I mentioned it last time, if anyone's walked through there or hasn't walked through, I encourage you to walk through. It's going to become quite a great new part of Fremantle with a hotel and more offerings for dining and entertainment. And I think part of it could also potentially be residential. So that is a small price to pay in the short term, but the benefit's going to be for amenity and revenue building long term will far outweigh the car park we have now.
Councillor Archibald.
Yeah, just a very small comment. I totally agree with what Councillor Lang has just said. And I was thinking of in the 90s when we took all the parking out of South Terrace to create South Terrace as it is today. And all it's done is made that street boom, because back in those days there weren't that many coffee shops, there weren't that many cafes. So it did totally transform that part of town. This is a bit different. We're trying to connect a World Heritage listed part of the city with the city in the way it used to be connected. So I think we do always have to be very cognizant of ensuring that parking is well catered for wherever we can possibly. Do it sensibly. But in this case, I think that connection overrides that. It is World Heritage listing. We're talking about World Heritage sites. And so I think it's very important from that point of view to do that and then have people being able to wayfind, as Councillor Sullivan said, the links between the two much more sensibly than we currently do.
Any further discussion before I close? I really think that maybe we can ask the officers when they're writing reports. I think when they put in this will lead to a loss of revenue of $90,000, I think is quite misleading, because what it should be saying is $90,000 was spent in this car park last year, and then to lose $90,000, every single person who parked in that car park would have to not come to Fremantle or go home without parking. Or the car park across the way is very rarely full. It's only full on big football days and so on. So the transition from parking there, which is a very awkward, horrible car park. I actually got involved in a crash coming out of it once, not my own fault. But the transition to persuade people to go from there across the road is not difficult, especially if we can put a path across the street. So I think and it's the same when we have parklets. If the parklet's going to cost $15,000 a year in lost revenue, well, it's not. Only if every other parking bay in the street is full all the time. So I think we really need to think about how we write that into the report. It's quite misleading, and it gets picked up by the media and so on, and makes us look foolish. So there's that point, and also it is a very awkward little car park and quite dangerous with things backing into each other, and so I'm very supportive of the project. So this is going to council, so I'll move the.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Are the nearest car parks to this, and I don't want to, I don't like car parks. I think we've got much higher uses for land, that's especially in the CBD. But I think the nearest car parks to this one, that would be the Wilson one.
No, straight across the road.
And
Under the prison.
and the Queen Gate, right? Wouldn't those be just as close as the one that by the prison?
Yeah, Wilson, but ours is cheaper. So there's the council car park under the prison, which is nice and shady and very cheap. Or there's the Wilson car park or the secure car park, which are much more expensive and not anywhere near as nice. So whether the loss of revenue would entirely go to Wilson and secure, we can't know. But are we all ready to vote? Okay, all those in favour, it's going to council. That's council over against. We need to go back to item 6, the information report. I missed that, I'm afraid. Are there any questions on the information report, which is on page 71? Councillor Sullivan, would you like to give a brief update on the Coles proposal from JDAP, if you could? That wasn't in here, because it wasn't done by then. Yeah, if you'd like to do
that. Well, I did circulate. I think all elected members were included, but yes, the JDAP approved the Wool Stores development, which is going to include a brand new Coles for Fremantle, which is very exciting. They did allow the 2 metre setback. You'll recall council did resolve that it felt that the 3.65 metre setback should be adhered to, and JDAP basically have overruled that and approved it with the 2 metre setback. But I would say there was a considerable amount of conversation about the need to make sure that the ends of the Queen Street frontage improved in some way at the pinch points of the footpath. So the footpath that's been proposed is reasonably generous for the majority of the Queen Street frontage, but has some pinch points near the roundabout, which is their main entrance to their shops, and also at the other end where it will abut the Adina hotel development. The good news was that they seemed to really understand that. There was a lot of conversation at the back of the JDAP room, a lot of nodding, a lot of accepting that there was probably things that they could do to improve those pinch points. But also importantly, they acknowledged that the way the hotel development will have to be designed will actually endeavour to actually have wider footpaths potentially because it's a major hotel entrance. But also they recognise that the road carriageway down that end gets a bit fatter because you've got to have slip lanes and the like. So look, I think it's a good outcome. It wasn't exactly what council had resolved, but equally, there was a lot of conversation and a lot of presentation about the functionality of the street as well as the functionality of the building. And also, I just highlight that I think had been one misunderstanding or misconception that the rest of the site was going to SDAU, the State Development Assessment Unit, and in fact, according to the applicant, that's not the case. The Adena Hotel, which is their stage 1B, this is 1A, is not part of the SDAU application, and they anticipate making a development application, presumably another JDAP one, in the foreseeable future. They want to be able to develop the hotel such that it's out of the ground and significantly underway before the supermarket reopens. They don't want to sort of have an empty site and then open the supermarket and then start, developing right immediately next door. They want to move on that quickly. Hopefully, that will be what happens, because that will give us the full Queen Street connection to the rail station, and really then puts a lot of additional emphasis on both ourselves and the state government getting a strategy in place for that Queen Street connection to the rail station and hopefully the forecourt. So I think that was all good news.
Thank you. Are there any questions on the information report? Okay, I'll move to be received. Seconder. Councillor Lang. All those in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you. And the final item is the policy review, item 8. I'll perhaps just ask the director briefly explain this. Part of it was emergency provisions brought in as part of the COVID emergency regulations, and I think that basically we've decided to keep some of them anyway because they were a good idea, and we're getting rid of the rest. But I'll ask the director to just clarify that.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, you're absolutely right. The state of emergency provisions were removed by government, so we need to follow suit and remove them out of our own policy. I think some confusion has occurred because when we added them a couple of years ago, we also made amendments to some other minor changes to that policy, which we're suggesting still stay in there. So this change that's before you is literally just removing those extra provisions that were put in under state of emergency. And on page 85 of the agenda, I think that's probably the easiest way to see what was in there that we're now suggesting that comes out under point 2.
Are there any questions from the director before we move into discussion? Okay, I'll move the officer's recommendation to accept this is going to council, by the way, to accept those changes to policy. As a seconder, Councillor Lawver. Any discussion? Councillor Lawver.
Oh, I just wanted to thank the planning staff for the immense work that went into explaining to me what was happening with this one. It makes sense to me, and I just wanted to thank you for the work to get me to understand it. Thank you.
Councillor Kamada.
Yeah, thank you for that too. Yeah, just one question. When the other amendments were made that were not emergency amendments, was the intent back then to keep them long term?
Through the chair, absolutely. It was a decision that they made sense then, and they would go in, and they had no relation at all to state of emergency, and that is where the subsequent confusion has been, because we took that opportunity 2 years ago to load it with both what was just sensible long-term solutions and then what we were compelled to do under state of emergency.
So does the end of the emergency mean that the coffee shop in South Fremantle can't park on the pavement anymore?
Councillor, you obviously haven't been to South Fremantle for a while.
I have, and there were cars all over the car park.
No, but the drive-through was immediately ceased operation. All the other matters are just normal matters in South Fremantle.
Well, it may not have been a drive-through, but it was covered in cars this week. So it's an enforcement issue.
Yeah, coffee carts are actually something that was being discussed and considered appropriate as a replacement to a drive-through. So I don't know if I think they got development approval for what they would do if they didn't have the drive-through. And it's a fairly substantial proposal to improve the public realm of what was the drive-through space. So.
Okay, is there any more further discussion? Okay, so this item is going to council. So all those in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you. And being no further business, I've got to read out all those things, haven't I? Motions of which previous notice have been given. There are none. Urgent business, none. Late items, none. Confidential business, none. So I'll close the meeting. Thank you for your attendance and close the meeting at 7:01.